Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Big Four Transparency Podcast. I'm joined today by Andrea Davis, a former director of resource management at Baker Tilly US, and most recently, the founder of Linked Workforce. Welcome to the podcast, Andrea.
Dominic, I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to have you on. You're actually the kind of one of the first people that I talked about planning this podcast with, and you were very encouraging about that. So, bit of a full circle moment now that I'm having you on. So as a bit of an intro, you've occupied some very impressive leadership roles in workforce planning and resource management, both at Deloitte and Baker Tilly. Are you able to share a little bit more about what those roles entail? Because as someone kind of more in the traditional, tax or audit streams, I don't really understand thoroughly what it is that's going on kind of behind those doors.
Absolutely. Well, first, congratulations on starting because I think this
Thank
is
you.
fantastic. And who better to do a podcast like this than you? So, huge congrats to you. Um,
Thank you.
Absolutely. So yeah, resource management for me was foreign before I started at Deloitte as well. So I did not know what that was. My background is in the HR space, but prior to going to Deloitte, I went to Deloitte and I was doing a combination role of HR and resource management. We went through a talent transformation, and then I split off and focused in on resource management. But for those who are not familiar, the goal of resource management for professional services firms is really to allocate the right resources at the right time, using their skill set, credentials, experience to make sure that they're aligned to client expectations and really to elevate that client experience, but also on the employee experience side, making sure that they're aligned appropriately where they feel comfortable and excited about the work they're delivering to clients.
Okay. And what are you using to measure that essentially? Like to understand like how employees are feeling? Like what are the tools you're typically using for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot of different ways this can be done. I think resource management, why I love it so much, is it's not a one size fits all. It can meet you where you are, wherever the firm is. But I think there's a couple things you can blend it with your performance management process, and thinking about skill sets where people want to elevate their careers or eventually get in their career. So partnering with the learning and development team. So if you have skills mapped out and truly understand the skills of the employees, where could you support them from a learning and development perspective, where they have opportunities that they don't have to go seek and hunt for, but they actually have a database where that lines up with their career aspirations. And then client satisfaction. I mean, to be quite honest, happy employees provide happy client service, and there's a positive outcome on the client side. So even weaving it in from a KPI perspective to client success, I think all of those measurements are really important, and tie back to productive and efficient and effective resource management.
Awesome. I mean, thanks for sharing. I would have never known that. Um, and then so for someone in your position, obviously we read a lot in the news kind of about our own jobs, right? Where like major accounting firms are talking a lot about the talent shortage and like all of the issues that entails for the firms. What are the conversations like within your team regarding those things?
Sure. Same type of conversations, because the talent shortage definitely impacts the resource management team, because that's what we do or take those resources and make sure that we're aligning them appropriately. And I think it's just
Hmm.
time to get creative. I think we've come from a long history in the accounting space and professional services space overall, where one person leaves, another person in. It's just a kind of more of like the sausage making factory, where I think it's time to pivot and understand that there's so many different type of work or talent models out there now, that just because one person leaves who is an FTE does not necessarily mean that it makes sense to replace that person with another FTE. There's so many different models to tap on in the gig marketplace, seasonal workforce, consultants. There is a lot of different talent models out there that I think if you're strategic, not only are you impacting your employees that are still there, that did not leave, and making sure that they still have a positive experience and feel supportive, but you're also tapping into a market that has not historically been tapped on to, that has some really, really great talent. So I think the talent shortage, lots to dig into in there, but I would say the variation of talent models, nearshore, offshore, and like I said, seasonal consultants. There's so many different opportunities that I think looking beyond just the FTE, or is also called full-time equivalent, replacement, is super important.
Mhm. So like this might be actually kind of driving further the move towards offshoring, I guess, right? Which makes sense, right?
A
If you're,
portion. Yeah.
yeah.
I
Okay,
think
interesting.
there's a healthy mix, I would say, and I would also I still throw in those gig market folks. There's so many people who maybe left the either through force during layoff processes, or through after COVID, just being exhausted and left the workforce, but they want some type of opportunities, and looking for shorter term opportunities that they would be great folks to tap into.
Do you have any like rough sense of like what percentage of labor that has kind of started as and what it makes up now? Like even just to contextualize that?
From a gig marketplace perspective, or from a offshoring,
Y-
or just in totality?
Yeah, maybe from a gig marketplace perspective. I feel like that's not documented as much. I've heard a ton of conversation about the offshoring, but I haven't actually heard anyone really talk that much about the gig marketplace. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of great research out there. I don't have concrete numbers to share, but that's something I can totally
Mhm.
dig into. But I would say there was a large, especially women who
Mhm.
left their jobs, whatever level of that they may have been in during COVID and after COVID, um, for whatever reason. And so that what we're seeing, I've read a couple of studies on a lot of those women are either not looking to go back into a full-time equivalent role, but are looking to do something to continue to expound on their career. And I feel like those are those gig
Mhm.
projects that these are super valuable folks. And it's not just women. I just know that was a large population, but great. I mean, such valuable individuals that could really bring and in some instances, elevate your team. Um, so supporting what they're looking to do, but also really bringing some true value to the team as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear because honestly, I think that answers an issue that's kind of on both sides a little bit better than some of the offshoring does, based on what I've heard from a lot of folks. Where, yeah, a lot of the frustration is the surge in busy season and stuff like that.
Yes,
Where a lot of the smaller firm owners I've spoken to say, we've dealt with this by automatically filing extensions, having a higher percentage of like actual accounting work, but of bookkeeping and financial statement work, but once you get into those large firms, yeah, like the Baker Tillys and the Deloittes, like, yeah, guess what? If you're the tax department, you're gonna have just a mountain of tax work to get through. So I think that
absolutely.
addresses that issue where you have this kind of like seasonal workforce potentially. And then on the flip side, like I could see it for someone who maybe can't quite financially leave the workforce, but is inclined to do so. And then this can kind of like bridge a little bit of a gap for them, right? Like, even
Absolutely.
potentially like someone in my shoes who's got a project that they're really focused on, but like is not quite at a point where like that's your full-time income. So, I mean, that's awesome to hear that that's growing more and more, right? Even within kind of the more traditional firm space, not just as a like you hear a lot of people doing TurboTax prepare work seasonally, but it's cool to hear that there's room for them at the traditional firms as well.
Yeah, and I will just from awareness perspective, I know all of the big four, and I'm sure a lot of the mid-market firms as well have this. They have a portals for temporary talent or gig workers. So definitely, if there is anyone looking for that, they're out there, and you can just in a quick Google search and just sign up.
Awesome. Well, yeah, if there's anyone listening who's interested, make sure you go check those out. So shifting gears a little bit beyond the kind of like talent pipeline discussions that I'm sure everyone's had enough of. What are some of the other biggest concerns being discussed at the firms you've been at? Like, and what's being done to address them?
Yeah. I think certainly we're hearing the decline in the accounting profession as a whole. I mean, that is just, I
Mhm.
mean, it's the elephant in the room that is truly it's concerning because you definitely it's something that's needed. I mean, it's a it's a industry that thrived during downtimes because everyone still needs accounting, no matter what time we're
Yeah.
in. And so I think we have to really think differently. And I think what I'm hearing a lot from different organizations I've been a part of is, a lot about the 150, a lot about the schooling or what's required to obtain your CPA, time to take your exams, those type of things, which I think certainly need to be discussed. They're important. However, I don't think that's the barrier to entry. There's a lot of smart folks out there who are willing to do the work to pass exams. I think we have to think differently about the industry as a whole. What folks are
Mhm.
not willing to do are work 80-hour weeks any longer, or kind of the hustle to prove yourself. You come in as an intern and you do the grunt work to make sure that you can prove yourself to be a partner in maybe 20 years down the road in your career. That's just not what
Mhm.
people want any longer. And so I think
Yeah.
now it's time for the accounting firms to take a step back and reevaluate what success looks like and how you obtain success and what that entry level. So switching from a hustle, kind of prove yourself culture to a learning culture, to bring people in to learn and teach and develop right out of the gate. To create a better balance. And then I think couple that with the multiple talent models that we just talked about, and you can create a more harmonious work environment. And I think that is what we need to focus on. But that requires a lot of proactiveness from organizations and firms and being thoughtful and planning, that traditionally has just not been the focus. But I certainly think there's a loud cry for that now.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think like the old incentive and just like extreme example of like delayed gratification
Yes,
maybe just doesn't cut it anymore, right? Like there's
that's right.
no paying your dues for 15 years anymore because as of year 2 you might have exit opportunities for a 40% increase and you say,
Exactly.
do I really need this? And I think people also are less driven by the need. Like, I think a lot more people are kind of realizing, like, I want to live my life
Yes.
ASAP with like a reasonable salary rather than be like, I'll sacrifice for 20 years and make $1 million a year. I
Yeah.
think both like the financial incentive of that like extreme upside, I think
Yes.
drives people a little bit less than it once did. And then at the same time, the patience is just maybe not what it was, right? And
Absolutely.
um, I include myself in that, right? Like I think for me, like I was just like, there's no way that I'm just going to be significantly underpaid for the next 5 years, and then maybe it'll be worthwhile, but maybe I won't even want to do it by then. So why
Right.
wait, right? So I mean, it's good to know that people in these positions, like you've been somewhere where you can actually drive a real change in these very large
Yes.
firms, are having these discussions, right? Because I think a lot of people think it's just totally falling on deaf ears and people are maybe not focused in the right place, but it is good to know that these discussions are happening.
Yeah. And the one thing I'll throw in there too that you just reminded me of is wanting to make an impact as well. Like
Yeah.
people want to know what their driving value, how they're driving value. So if there's not a connection with the mission or connection with what their work is impacting, I think it creates boredom. It creates there's
Mhm.
no gratification there of like my impact that I'm making on a day-to-day basis. And then I'm working all these hours. So
Yeah.
um, there is something to say for um COVID. I mean, let's just be honest. COVID made a lot of people rethink. You lost loved ones. There was a lot of things that happened during the COVID time that made you rethink how you want to live your life. And you know, for whatever that means for each individual, it does mean something. And I think we can't forget that that was a pivotal time in the world, and it's going to be here. It's not going to go away in a couple years. It's going to always be here.
Mhm. Yeah. Do you think that that was really like a switch that flipped? Because part of it, like people like to say, like, oh, this new generation, right? But do you think that also, yeah, like that switch of like having gone through that really changed people's perceptions kind of in a relatively drastic way all at once?
I do. I think, yes, there's generational differences. There's a lot. I think there's 5 generations right now working in the workforce together. So certainly there's generational differences. Absolutely. But I also think
Hmm.
COVID had a major impact, and I think it's sometimes underappreciated for the impact that it had on the workforce. People are still dealing with the outputs of COVID, and the impacts to their lives, really, whether that's return to work or return to office mandates, whether that's a change in their work environment, layoffs. There's a lot of impacts and downward stream impacts that happen there. Even being able, if you have children or you're a caretaker, even being able to find care is still a difficult process for a lot of folks. So I do think it was a switch of a truly turning point in how the world operates, and especially in the business world and business community.
Interesting. That's not like a perspective that I had actually. Like that's interesting to hear that. I'd be inclined to agree with what you're saying. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so you mentioning some of these challenges and some of the discussions being had. Do you think that firms are spending kind of enough time and also maybe resources thinking about these challenges, or do you think that it's still maybe not getting the full attention within the firm that it deserves? Because obviously there's a team talking about these things, but there's a difference of like if there's a team who feels like they can move mountains because they have all these resources, or if it's a team who's like feels like they really need to sell these ideas to the rest of the firm for them to be executed. What's that dynamic like?
I think it's a mix. I do, because
Okay.
there is a partnership. There's a lot of people at the table typically that are having these discussions. There's different business units, different service lines, all having differing opinions and being on one part of the spectrum or another. I do
Hmm.
think that's a barrier to overcome, right? Because now you have to understand um, each individual concern within each service line or business unit and be able to address those. So that is certainly a challenge. But I do think from an overall leadership perspective, I do feel like most leadership feel like this is an issue that they want to address, or it's a challenge, I should say, that they definitely want to address. I'm hearing from a lot of leaders that I've either worked with or prospecting with, to partner with and work with, that they really do want to get the people resource management part right. They want to make sure that they're aligning the right people with the right skill sets. And that's where I think the skills first movement, quite frankly, you're moving from a role based movement to a skills first movement, is so important, because you have to think differently on how you're allocating your resources. So I do think it's at the forefront, but I do think this is a multi-year shift. This is definitely, a marathon and not a sprint, and it takes targeted strategy and leadership buy-in to really move the needle forward. And then I'll just go back to, it takes it buy-in from your employees as well. Really, do they understand why this change is happening, or why the firm wants to shift? So really bringing them along the journey, I think, is extremely important.
Okay. What can you elaborate a little bit on this skills first movement you mentioned? Because I'm not familiar with that actually.
Oh, it's like my favorite thing. So, so
Perfect.
I here's a great example. You look at a job description and you read it, and you're like, yeah, of course, I meet all the, maybe I have to have a certification, obviously, for the CPA, for example, in the accounting industry. Um,
Hmm.
Great. But how do you know exactly what you'll be doing in that role, or what skill sets are needed? I think there are some organizations that are getting creative of a people leader versus a non-people leader, of a technology focused role versus non-technology focused role, which those are great. But I think getting to the meat of really aligning the right folks with the right type of work and projects are really understanding their skill set, um, and what they bring to the table, whether that's functional, leadership, technical, process, whatever that looks like, and what makes that person who they are. Again, I go to like understanding who you employ and who's working for you is so important, because that's how you align them. If you think about, I was having a conversation when I was rolling skills out, at Baker Tilly, and one of the conversations were, well, why do we want to know that someone like is a yogi outside of work? I said, well, the why you might want to know that is because you have a wellness program, right? Well, what if you're doing chair yoga? You have a person who, how excited would it be to, like, do chair yoga for the whole firm of, however many thousands of people, and get a break from their day to day to be able to do something that they're passionate about. So when I say skills first, I think some people think of that of just related to the job. And I think of beyond just related to the job. It's like, what else can they bring to their work that helps make them, more fulfilled? So it's really moving from a description to really getting down to the skills and proficiencies of who you employ.
That's such a like refreshing mindset that I hope gets adopted very broadly, because I
Thanks.
do think, right, like people are more, yeah, absolutely, like people are more than just the few things that are on their resume. And I
Yes.
think that addresses not only the fear of getting pigeonholed because you're doing this specific thing, which I've heard a lot of people get afraid of in either tax or audit, and like, oh, I
Yeah.
can't progress beyond this certain point because then I'm going to be stuck in this forever. So
Hmm.
having the skills first approach, I guess, allows them to develop more of a rounded skill set. But then I think it's just people, like you say, are like more than just their work inputs.
Yes.
And like being seen for like everything you bring for the table would be, or bring to the table would be like extremely refreshing, I think, right? And being asked to do something way outside of your role, but that they somehow know that you're going to be good at because of these other things they've looked at would be fantastic. Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
that seems like a very sustainable, real solution for people out there,
Absolutely. And I
which is
mean, we are in
awesome.
a remote environment, so what better way to like even promote networking um,
Yeah.
with common interests and skill sets?
Yeah. So, it feels like the talent crisis has been, right, the like big topic for the last maybe 2 or 3 years, or like you mentioned, maybe kind of in the fallout of COVID. Um, what was like the big thing before that, and were they guiding towards this talent, shortage, or is it mostly kind of reactive now that it's happening?
Yeah, I think before that, certainly the accounting industry as a whole, we're thinking about the shortages. There is a shortage there, so I think it was definitely a
Okay.
conversation before, um, but now it's the reactive because it's becoming more aggressive, and I think it maybe snuck up a little
Mhm.
bit quicker than was expected. Um, so I think now it's really time for the pivot to see what can we do differently. What are the non-traditional ways? Tradition is great, but until it stops working, so then you have to pivot.
Yeah.
What are those non-traditional ways that really make sense to make sure that we're building the pipeline? And also, again, I just go back to the culture of accounting. Um, that has to shift in order to continue to retain and attract top talent.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Like, I think there's a lot that's on the other side of, again, people blame the education side of things, but I don't think it's really that. Like,
Yeah,
people will pursue a PhD in history because
absolutely.
maybe it's intrinsically rewarding, or, right, like people will do whatever it takes to get into investment banking because the financial rewards are there. And I think it's like the industry really needs to take a look at itself and go, okay, maybe the 150 hours thing is an issue. Like, maybe we're creating unnecessary barriers to entry, but like beyond that, like, why don't people want to come here? Because again, people go to extraordinary lengths for all kinds of things, provided that the incentives are there, right? So
Right.
yeah, it really is. I think that like the industry needs to take a look at itself and be like, why aren't people willing to do this one extra step to get here? Well, maybe it's because we haven't made it desirable enough to be here, right?
That's right.
So that's very much my perspective on the whole issue, basically. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
yeah, I agree. I think it's when you go to therapy, like if you were to go to therapy, they always say to look and like let's assess, do a self-assessment. And I certainly think anytime you're trying to triage a challenge, self-assessment first before you look outward is so important.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I guess moving beyond kind of your roles at Deloitte and Baker Tilly. Um, what was it that kind of made you want to go out independently on your own? And then I want to talk a little bit more about kind of what it is you do now and who you can help. But yeah, like what was really kind of the driving force, because you really were in a very influential role in these places, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so grateful for my opportunities at both Deloitte and Baker Tilly. I truly, I actually, I would not be able to go out on my own without those experiences,
Mhm.
because I have, whether it's because I took opportunities that people didn't want, and I'm like, I'll do it, and they put me in roles that were challenging to me, and also allowed me to learn, a lot of
Mhm.
great opportunities, or a lot of great skill sets, I should say. Um, but I would
Mhm.
say I've thought about it for a long time. It's always entrepreneurship. I've always had an entrepreneur mindset. And so it's always been in the back of mind. I think the thing last year where I was just like, you know what, it's the time to pursue it. There were a couple things. One, a lot of folks were reaching out to me. So to be quite frank, I was being tapped on to get ideas on how to do transformation, how to do workforce planning, how to do resource management, and where to start. What's the technology? And so I was having informal conversations. And as I was having these conversations, I'm like, well, I would love to do this. I love transformation work. I love to look at challenges and dig in and lead through challenge through transformation and be agile through that. Um, last year, I talked to someone and I said, if I started an organization, would you hire me? And that they said yes, and they actually did. so I said, well, you know what, if I don't take the leap, you have to, something that you and I have talked about before, if you don't start, you'll never do it. So I felt like it was the right timing personally, in my personal life, and then also where I was at in my professional life. I felt like I had the credibility. I have a strong network where now I can take that on a road and really kind of help and support and help folks through their resource management transformation and their skills for strategies. So that was my inspiration. And I do want to be the change for professional services. I would like linked workforce to be the, poster child for what professional services can truly look like, and change the game, sort of say.
Yeah, I'm right with you on that. Like I would say I don't possess this HR knowledge and skills and whatnot to be like, here's how we're gonna fix it. But I think that the best disinfectant is sunlight, right? So
That's
kind of
right.
just going like, hey, here are the issues. It's undeniable. Here's what everyone's saying.
Yes.
Can be like a contributor to kind of helping the profession, because again, like I have a lot of love for the accounting profession, and I
Yes.
do think it gets a bad rap. And even though there are some very real challenges, there is this kind of future where it's like it could be actually really great. It could be such a
Oh, yeah.
profession that's so full of pride, but like is kind of like stuck in some of these challenges, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I hope that linked workforce is a huge driver of some of this change.
Thank
And
you.
even if it happens kind of firm by firm, right, where you kind of move from one project to the next, eventually like that adds up to be a huge impact. So um,
Absolutely.
I really hope that's the case. And so for like listeners of this podcast, because I've worked a lot with kind of firm owners on this, what is something practical that these firms should be keeping top of mind as they develop their talent pools?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the number one thing is don't lose sight of the employee experience. At the end of the
Mm-hmm.
day, all of us are trying to deliver great client service, attract amazing clients, and execute on what we promise. And I think that starts with having an employee pool that has a positive employee experience, that is not overburdened with a lot of administrative work, which we know time entry is always on top of mind.
Yeah.
There's already CPE credits and all these other things that are important to the profession. They need to happen, right? They're compliance driven. It's super important. So how can we make their lives easier? Also bring in some of their understanding their skills, that where they can maybe lend a hand across other parts of the organization or firm, that might be energizing to them. So I think
Mhm.
I would always say in your strategy, as you're setting up for a new year, we're in January and people are really thinking about what they want to execute on this year. It's really thinking about how will you impact that employee strategy to drive to the business operations and results that you're looking for. And that example that I gave earlier with understanding that someone on your team is a yogi, how much money are you saving right there just not hiring an external, instructor for a wellness plan that you were going to do anyway. So it really does impact business priorities and business revenue as well when you take that skills first approach. So to tie it in a bow, I would just say, thinking of skills first and not waiting, you have to start somewhere, even if it's not perfect. The other thing is
Yeah.
the employee experience, because all of this then impacts your clients in a positive way.
Mm. And then like what are some of the signs for like an accounting firm that it's time to call up Andrea or Linked Workforce to
Yeah.
kind of come in and help them out? Like what are some of the telltale signs that like an intervention or some kind of internal changes are needed?
Yeah. I would certainly say if you're still resourcing and scheduling in Excel, 100% need to call me.
Yeah.
If you don't know the skill sets of your employees, I think that is something where we can definitely strategize. Or if you are feeling like every leader that calls you is saying that we're tight on resources, but your
Mm.
utilization and revenue numbers are saying something different. So if your data is not matching what you're hearing, I think that is a time to give us a call as well. Because that
Mm.
is a signal. That's a signal that maybe you are not optimizing your workforce and the different talent pools and models that we talked about earlier, and you can certainly do
Mhm.
things better. And I think the last thing is if you're experiencing really high burnout from your team. So if you're
Mhm.
looking back on data and they're charging crazy hours during high peak times, probably a time to give us a call.
Okay, right on. And where is the best place to do so? Where's the best place to reach out to?
Yeah, so info@linkedworkforce.com. Our website is linkedworkforce.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn. So yes, we are
Okay.
out there. You can reach out directly to me on LinkedIn as well, and I'd be happy to direct you. But yeah, we're
Mhm.
excited to have a great 2024. And like you said, one professional services firm at a time, just really making that impact and making that difference and leaving it happier than where we found it.
That's awesome. Before letting you go, I have one kind of bonus question where I was like
Uh-oh.
really trying to source from kind of my audience, and I asked on Reddit as well. I obviously had to dig through a lot of things of like, why do you hate me? Which is not the questions I'm going to go for, but one of the ones that I thought was actually like exceptionally good was around kind of reconciling the return to office and outsourcing efforts
Yeah.
and basically like how those discussions are happening within firms, right? Because on the one hand, they're saying, hey, all this work can happen remotely, not in office, actually in an entirely different country.
Yes.
But then, kind of on the other hand, there's this message that, like, hey, we actually need to be together. We need to be in person to get our best work done. Do you know, like, how that's being kind of reconciled, how that's being discussed in firms at all?
Yeah, I actually just posted on LinkedIn about this exact thing. So that's a great
Okay,
question.
perfect.
Yeah. Because I think there's a couple things. It has to be purpose driven. I would tie it back
Mm-hmm.
to if you're going to mandate a return to office, understand the purpose of what's trying to be accomplished. We know that
Mm-hmm.
things can be accomplished remotely. We've established that through offshoring. I mean, even if you have an office and an offshore and they co-work together, you still are doing remote work and being able to accomplish tasks together. And
Mm-hmm.
so if there is not a purpose, so like, for example, I could give learning drivers. There might be opportunities to come in person to do, simulated work or learning opportunities that may be best held in person, or strategy sessions, for example. Those might be best held in person. But if you're just asking me to come in office to sit next to someone, for me to potentially have a question to tap them on the shoulder, which is these are things I've actually heard, like, hey, remember when you could just tap someone on the shoulder and just ask? One that's highly intrusive and disruptive if someone is heads down doing some work, so it's less, actually becomes less productive. And then the second thing is I can tap someone in Teams or Zoom or Teams or Slack or whatever collaboration tool that you utilize easily, and they can respond when they are available. So I would challenge anyone that says that I want to be able to tap someone on the shoulder, because it actually decreases productivity. But I would encourage those that are using it for learning opportunities or really strategic and purpose-driven ways when you're in the office. That I think it makes a lot of sense. And I could give more examples, but I don't want to impede on the time. But I would use the word purpose driven. I think that's the most important. It's Please be clear on the purpose, and I think that people will be more apt and open to return to the office if they truly understand what the goal is of doing so.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then I guess like there needs to be that follow through where it needs to be like, hey,
Yes.
we are actually doing these in person sessions because yeah, I my partner actually like she goes in office and then does
Mhm.
Zoom calls from the office all day, and it's like, well, why are we doing this, right? So yeah, there is
Yeah.
a way to make it make sense to people. So I guess
Yes.
hopefully that gets to some people leaders out there or some firm owners of how to make it make sense to your employees. So thanks for answering that, Andrea, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. This has been great. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.